glad you guys look out for me. It's crazy. It's very hard to teach 5 classes online at home with children and responsibilities. But anyways, yeah. Thank you, Seth, for the reminder to record. I appreciate that. Romans 3 years, week 9. Okay, so I did assign in the textbook reading the Qur'an, or rather, sections on Islam and Justinian. So Rome's 3 heirs are basically, you know, the 3 Roman civilization kind of splits asunder, and out of that comes, I guess, a power vacuum in the Mediterranean region. And Islam isn't really like a direct cultural heir or political heir to Rome, but it's included in this because it helps fill the power vacuum in the southern and eastern Mediterranean area when Rome falls. I mean, there's no kind of Western global empire anymore. So when the empire falls, you get the splitting of the West into a bunch of different competing parts. And it's not all competition. They all learn from each other. There's quite a bit of trade and intercourse between the Byzantine Empire and the kind of empire of Islam that rises very quickly. There's trade, you know, between, you know, there's emissaries from the court of Charlemagne to the Byzantine Empire. You know, like they're all talking to each other, and sometimes they fight, sometimes they don't. But they all share something in common, which is this post-Roman figuring out of how the world should be ordered after Rome falls down and goes boom. So that's kind of the theme of this week. And Charlemagne isn't quite, like the medieval West isn't quite mentioned this week because we're going to spend most of the rest of the semester talking about the Middle Ages, really, all the way up to like the early modern period. So I figure, you know, we'll be talking about this over the next 5 weeks or so. Anyway. So yeah, the Qur'an. The Qur'an is the first document set that I have assigned for this week. It plays an important part in the paper assignment as well. That's due by the end of today. So yeah, well, you'll remember the canons of the Catholic Church from last week. The Qur'an has kind of a similar structure to that because this is, you know, a set of rules and a set of guidelines for how one should live their life. It's similar to other pieces of scripture that we've read. So parts of the Jewish Bible or the, I don't think I assigned actually anything from the New Testament. But anyway, the Qur'an's got a similar structure to other religious scriptures in the Abrahamic tradition. And that's because, you know, Islam views the Jewish and Christian God as being the same God as Allah. It's all the same guy, or all the same deity. But obviously Islam interprets things a little bit differently, particularly with the Prophet Muhammad introducing all these kinds of rules and guidelines, you know, to the people of the Middle East. So what are some of the rules and guidelines that are outlined in these selections of the Quran? What are the faithful Muslims supposed to be doing here? And there's like a ton, you know, you just like throw a dart.
Well,
sorry, I couldn't quite hear that, Ben.
it wasn't me who said anything. It was someone.
Oh, okay, it might have been Seth. Sorry, Seth.
They talk about the pilgrimage.
Yeah, the pilgrimage. I don't remember where that is actually, or what it said about the pilgrimage. What
Not
particular?
really.
What does that mean? The pilgrimage.
I don't know if it says in here, but I know that actually, like, you're supposed to go to Mecca for like a big prayer time thing.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, here it is, page 243, verse 196. Perform the pilgrimage and holy visit, the Umrah to Mecca, in the service of God. So this is one of the five. So there are 5 pillars of Islam. I don't think I can probably remember all of them offhand right now. There's alms to the poor. There's prayer, where you turn towards Mecca and you pray 5 times a day. There, or is it 3 times? I should know this. I think it's 5 times a day. The pilgrimage is another one. There's the lesser and greater jihad, and and jihad, it has like a terrible understanding of what that is in the West, thanks to 9/11. But it's this, struggle, personal struggle and an external struggle against non-belief, I guess. But yeah, the pilgrimage to Mecca is one of them. Every able-bodied person should visit Mecca once in their lifetime. If you're able to. If you're not, it's fine. It's like Muhammad qualified this. He's like, if you can't visit Mecca on pilgrimage, don't worry about it. God understands. But if you can, then you should. And you're right. Mecca is kind of the holy city it's the holiest site of Islam. There's lots of different holy sites, but it's where the religion was founded. And so returning to kind of the origin site of Islam is very important for Muslims. So yeah, this is mentioned directly by Muhammad here in the Quran. And it should be mentioned that the whole Quran is Muhammad. Like, this is Muhammad receiving revelations from God, or from Allah, and then writing it down and giving it to the faithful, right? So unlike the Bible, where it's just a piecemeal bunch of randomness thrown together to form a cohesive whole, the Quran is much more uniform because it's a single author. Okay, so what other rules, what other things does Muhammad instruct Muslims to do? What other things should a good faithful Muslim be doing in life? Or how should one live their life according to the Quran?
Well, must live a life of, benevolence and kindness, and don't indulge evil or even go near it.
Right? Yeah. Lots of instruction here on piety, on, this comes up a lot. Piety comes up a lot. Just doing listening to God when he tells you to do something, like just, follow your conscience. Don't fall into evil. There's this belief similar to the Judeo-Christian tradition that, there are unseen dark forces at work and they're trying to lead you astray. Don't listen to those voices. Right. Like, treat your brothers and sisters with kindness and respect. There's rules on retribution for murder, forgiveness, for sins or retributions against one's personal self. Following a straight path. And a lot of talk about, like, don't forget that you're a special person created by God and you're destined to follow God's instructions. Like, don't forget that. So, okay. Are there any similarities that you perceive, like, especially those of you who grew up in a religious background or a religious household, or at least you're familiar with ancient scripture? Are there any similarities that you see here between, like, Judaism or Christianity?
Well, the one all-powerful God being the major one, especially the same God.
Yeah.
As well as how, although the details are different, as well as the general idea of having to live a virtuous life and worship this God
Mm-hmm.
and love them. Although in detail it's different, the concept is the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anyone else have any nuances to that? Any other thoughts on that?
There's a lot of don't worry too much about your life when bad things start happening. God's got you covered.
Yeah. God's got you covered. Yeah. I can't remember. I'm really terrible at memorizing chapters and verses of pretty much anything, whether it's like the Bible or Shakespeare or, like whatever. But at some point Jesus says, I think in the book of Matthew, don't worry about tomorrow. Today has enough troubles of its own. Cast your worries upon God. He can take your worries if they're too much for you. In other words, like, pray for relief. Yeah. So there's that similar, God's got your back. So there's this belief, and both of you are leading towards this point. There's this belief in, whether it's Christianity or Islam, like, there's this belief in a personal God, like a God who knows you as an individual and loves you and wants you to do the right stuff. It's not just some, like, ephemeral deity who's floating around in the ether, who, like, accidentally created stuff and just doesn't care. Like, it's a belief in a very personal deity who wants you to be happy, wants you to be prosperous, wants you to be faithful, and wants you to do good in the world, and will remind you if you don't do good stuff. So yeah, this belief in a very personal God who cares about human beings. Yeah, so good. Any other similarities that you perceive here between the other religions we've talked about in this class and Islam? Or are those pretty much the main ones? If not, I'm happy with that comparison. So yeah, now obviously there are a lot of differences. And anyone who's lived not under a rock in the last 20 years, knows that there are some fundamental differences between Islam and Christianity, or at least, perceived differences. And whether those differences are major or minor is kind of in the eye of the beholder. But at the very least, the Qur'an is written and developed in a very different place and time than Roman occupied Judea, in the case of the Gospels. So what parts of the Qur'an tell us about the environment? Now, and your textbook gives you a lot more context and background to this, but, like, I don't know, how does it strike you reading this document? Is the Quran developed and written in a time of, like, total peace and happiness? Or is it kind of born out of a moment of struggle and uncertainty? What do you guys think?
Well, based on all of the talk of struggle and overcoming it, I would guess that there was a significant amount of struggle that would have been relevant to people who would have wanted to believe in Islam and worship Allah and follow the word of Muhammad.
Yeah. Yeah. The context is really important here because, like, Muhammad's writing. He's receiving these revelations from God while he's still living in Mecca, and he's talking to people about like, hey, I'm hearing voices from the Jewish and Christian God. And at this point, you know, the Middle East is still this kind of hodgepodge of polytheistic religions. Like there's still belief in these pagan, what become pagan gods. And Muhammad's trying to convince people like, no, there's one God and he's awesome and he's talking to me. And he wants us to live our lives in this particular way. And and by the way, we're kind of related to these other faiths that we're familiar with. And he receives a lot of pushback, and he's eventually chased out of Mecca. And he and his loyal followers go to the city of Medina to the north and have to take refuge there until they can form an army and come back and conquer Mecca. So, yes, there's a lot of emphasis on strife and conflict and struggle, because that's the general context that this is born into. So, so that's important. You know, the context in which these scriptures are written is important. And I'm not making a judgment call on like, you know, the accuracy or believability or anything of these scriptures, but trying to stay neutral in this and just teach it. But the historical context is incredibly important for these things. And, you know, this eventually, we'll talk about the Crusades in a couple of weeks, and how there are fundamental differences in understanding, and there's conflict baked into, these organized religions, or ways at least of justifying conflict, right? So anyway, okay. Yeah, we'll talk more about Islam when it comes to the Crusades, which are super interesting. Okay, Life of Charlemagne, Einhard, page 262, if you're following along. Well, how would you, okay, this is kind of an interesting document because it's a biography of Charlemagne written by one of the people in his court. He's a good friend of Charlemagne, and we get a little bit of bias, perhaps because it's written by a good friend of Charlemagne. Anyway, judging.
I add to that it starts, literally the first sentence is, what has gone before is a fair picture of Charlemagne and all that he did to protect his large kingdom.
Yeah.
So you felt like you needed to cover his bases, it seems.
Yeah, Coya here. He's like, look, I'm being fair here. I had access to Charlemagne when he was still alive. But just believe me, folks. Believe me. I'm being unbiased. Yeah. So according to this portion of this biography written by someone in his court, how would you describe Charlemagne? What kind of picture do we get of Charlemagne? Who, by the way, is a medieval ruler. He tries to reform the Roman Empire. The Reich, the First Reich is kind of Charlemagne, and he tries to form this kind of like Western, like it's part French, part Germanic. It's weird. His capital is in Aachen, which is like up in like near the modern day Netherlands. And he tries to rebuild the Roman Empire. So this is a guy a couple centuries after, or a few centuries after the Roman Empire falls, and he's a feudal lord trying to reform the Roman Empire. So that's who Charlemagne is. He's this great king. What kind of personal picture do we get of him, though? What are some of his characteristics? And I don't know. How would you describe Charlemagne?
He's kind of like a King Arthur type.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Like, with the story of King Arthur, like his whole thing is like, oh, he's such a great guy, you know, because he's really minor flaws, but we don't care about those. Look how cool he is. Took sword out of a rock. Let's go.
Yeah, his flaws are overshadowed by his good heart and worthiness to be a good king. Yeah. So okay, yeah, that's an interesting. I didn't really think of it that way. Kind of a King Arthur, this very wholesome, benevolent king who is not a bad guy. Um, like he would be able to lift Thor's hammer. He's so wholesome and worthy, and you know, yeah, that's definitely a good picture of what we get here. What else? How would you describe? What kind of characteristics does he have? What's his personality like?
He's very noble and determined and ambitious. He wants to build it. He says that he's very ambitious, wanting to build this empire and amass a righteous cause as well.
Yeah. Yeah, right. He's got the same ambition as like when Tacitus talks about, the ambition of Augustus and how this is like something to be emulated and something to be looked at and like, oh, this is someone who's living their life really well. Or is that Seneca? Yeah, I think it was Seneca. But anyway, like this ambition is a positive trait of his. Because he wields it in a very noble way. Yeah, so he's this, like King Arthur-esque kind of character who's just this like, great king, or at least the people in his court think he's a great king. So what kinds of decisions does he make though, in this story, or policies that he follows that kind of paint him as this noble, benevolent king? Like, does he actually do anything to prove this or back this up?
Well, he acts what seems to be very, down to earth and humble. He rides on a horseback personally to various locations throughout his empire to give them information.
Mm-hmm.
He looks down on excessive drinking and drunkenness, and once tried to steady this man who was a drunkard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. He goes to church morning and evening. Like he goes to mass every day, twice a day. He's this very pious guy. He even rescues the Pope of Rome from, and in fact, there is this kind of revolt in Rome against the Pope, who, by the way, the Pope at the time kind of rules the area around Rome like his own personal fiefdom. Like the Pope is basically a king, and people are mad at him for certain things, and he rides to Rome personally to save the Pope, and the Pope, in turn, grants him, it's not mentioned here, but grants him the title of Holy Roman Emperor, like gives him the title of Roman Emperor. This guy who lives in Northern Europe, who nonetheless is following in the footsteps of the Caesars in building up political power, but he's also holy. So he's the Holy Roman Emperor, because he saves the Pope from, a marauding gang of bad guys. So yeah, like he's a very hands-on king, and this is what draws people to him. He's very popular. Now, part of the reason why he like tours around Europe and delivers information personally is like he has kind of a mobile court at all times. He doesn't really, like, Aachen is his like de facto capital, but he will take up residence in Germany. He'll take up residence in Italy. He'll rotate to France. Like he kind of makes this like circuit where he's not really staying in any one castle permanently. He's just moving around to better administrate his empire. And this was, kind of a common thing to do at the time. But anyway, he gets a lot of credit for doing it. What do you think? This is a bullshit account of Charlemagne? Like, if you were using this document to write a biography of Charlemagne, what kinds of questions would you be asking? Like, what kinds of things would you be looking for that were left out? In other words, like, do you fully trust this account of Charlemagne?
No, I don't.
Okay. Why? What are some things that you would be looking for?
I feel a lot of transitionary information is left out. I feel like we jump all over the place in time, and there isn't enough information on how we got from here to there.
Yeah.
You know, he has his empire, and he has conquered, but that's all we really know. He doesn't explain how he built this empire exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Did he do it by conquest and coercion and all the things that a bad king would do? Well, we don't know. It's not here. Not enough information. Yeah, it kind of reads like his greatest hits of, accomplishments rather than like an actual fair account of his life. What other thoughts do you guys have on this? Like, what other things are left out, perhaps, or are biased in this account? Anything else?
There really aren't any flaws, like, per se. Like, it's basically like, yeah, he did this really great thing, and then he goes and does this really great thing, and now he's doing this great thing. There's no in between or showing like, well, the only reason why he was in this area is because he was money laundering. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, he's way too perfect, according to this document. Like, it almost makes you suspicious, right? Or should make you suspicious. We're like, where's this guy's flaws? Like, he has none, and that's not real. That's not real life. That's not how any of this works, right? Yeah. Any other thoughts on Charlemagne?
Another thing I find interesting is all of the mentions of these dangerous conspiracies against Charlemagne.
Yeah.
The German conspiracy. There was this queen who worked with the conspirators, like his wife,
Yeah.
and I just find that very interesting, like how frequent this is. Like he mentions it.
Yeah. Yeah. They hate us because they ain't us is kind of the mentality here. Like, everyone's jealous of Charlemagne and his perfect personality and his brain and his wonderful beard and body and smarts, and gosh, he's so perfect, and everyone hates him for it. Yeah, it raises a few eyebrows, right? One of the interesting things, and I didn't ask about this in the guided reading questions, is the gendered component that you can see here in this document. And that is, in fact, one of the questions I'm asking you to write about for the assignment. Is there's this kind of crafty queen who's sort of his foil in a sense, where like there's the good noble man ruler, and then there's like the seditious, backstabbing, gossipy woman who's his opposite. That tells us a little something about how women are regarded, especially like female rulers or female royalty. There's this woman who's kind of conspiring and looking to trip up this noble man. That tells us something about late classical era, early medieval thoughts on gender. Women are especially women were cursed first, according to the Bible. The Adam and Eve story, which everyone believes in at this point. Eve is the first sinner, and she's kind of cursed with, women are therefore inherently more duplicitous. They're more unstable. They're more emotional. Their period is thought of as being like this curse, like a literal, like physical curse that they have to relive every month, all because of Eve.
I find that also interesting to compare to the Pandora story from the Greeks.
Yeah.
About how a woman was either the first to cause damage upon like harm upon humanity, or is created literally by the gods as a punishment.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, exactly. Historical sexism is completely rampant. Like there is this strong belief in the weaker sex. There's a greater sex and a weaker sex, and it's very clear as to what a woman's role should be or how women are perceived or thought about. There's also in the Charlemagne story, I want to highlight this too. Charlemagne makes sure to provide an education for his sons and daughters, and he loses a lot of his sons in like childhood and stuff, but he has all these daughters, and he's like, you know what, they should be educated too, because I'm a benevolent man, right? Like I love my kids. But he said, and I'm going to try and find it. It's the first full paragraph on page 263. Charlemagne was determined to give his children, his daughters, just as much as his sons, proper training in the liberal arts. And we'll talk more about the liberal arts in a couple weeks, which form the subject of his own studies. But he teaches the men how to hunt and ride horses, right? But he also makes sure that his daughters, says this, he made his daughters learn to spin and weave wool, use the distaff and spindle, and acquire every womanly accomplishment rather than fritter away their time in sheer idleness. Like he makes his girls, do household stuff. Like their job, their role is to stay within the household and make clothes, and these womanly accomplishments. So again, like there's this very gendered way of looking at the world that's inherent in these writings, right? So I wanted to highlight that because you are asked about that in the essay assignment for this week. So there's a couple different things you could draw upon. There's the queen, the duplicitous queen. There's the education. When it comes to Perpetua, you could take that document any number of ways. So I wanted to highlight that before we go today, just in case that's helpful to some of you as you're crafting your final draft. Any questions on this or the assignment or anything you want to just point out? Or
there is something I want to point out that doesn't directly relate to the document.
Yeah.
So I watched an episode of what I believe was called The Dark Ages. It was a History Channel episode, and it was all about Charlemagne. And I swear that this Life of Charlemagne is the only source they used for it, because it references everything that's mentioned in here and nothing else about Charlemagne's life.
And that's problematic.
I agree. But that's the History Channel, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. History Channel. I haven't watched History Channel since I was probably in middle school. I can't stand it. It became something weird and perverted, ancient aliens, all this stuff, like 10, 15 years ago when it first started out. It started out being just history, and then it got into reality TV, and then it just kind of went downhill from there. I don't put much stock in History Channel, and I love history, so. But yeah, that's problematic for the reasons we talked about. Like if you're relying on one very glowing source, that's problematic because you're not going to get the full picture. And look, you guys are smarter than the History Channel for knowing that. Like this is the value of a college education, is you can sniff out bullshit or at least have it on your radar, thinking like, am I getting the full story in this? What is being left out here? How can I verify these facts? And kudos to you, Ben, and to you guys for doing these assignments and learning in this way. You're much more prepared for life than the average citizen as a result. That's the value of an education.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So any other questions or comments before we go? Okay. Well, I appreciate you all very much. Thank you for being here. hope this is good for you. And let me know if you have any questions, by this afternoon about the assignment. I'll get you things about the exam. The exam is next week. I'm going to put it up hopefully by the end of today. So you'll have, a whole week to work on it. I don't have a study guide or anything because I figured since it's open book, there's not much to study for. You can just open up the exam and start working on it because it is open book. And you can stop and go as you please. So the exam will be up by the end of today, in other words, and it's due next Friday. All right. Thank you all. Have a great weekend, and I appreciate you. I'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.